Hi there, Randi Green here. Let us sum up and finish the course material. We are on page 4 where we talk about the systemic gates, the Stargates, the main bridges. You call them whatever you want to call them. It doesn't matter that much. It's just terminology for something that we don't really know how to put in some kind of wording since we don't really see the full scope of what we're dealing with here. Compared to the original material in the HAL Philosophy book, as well as in the Souls of Humanity book, including what I began in podcast number 2, where I talked about the D3 gates, I have now, the day after, I have done a little bit of corrections because when I wrote the Souls of Humanity in 2014, we were still under the old world order technologies and under the regress races and their alterations. Then we have had the whole event program. We have had the matrix of change, the Niburian matrix of change. We have had all of these different settings and relooping, and a lot of stuff has actually been, there's been some kind of terraforming as well. So thereby I've shifted a little bit around with the gate systems. And in a way, I would also address the India gate, even though it is a D3 gate. I would actually say, well, if I were to put it somewhere today, I probably more put it under D4, because that has changed. So thereby I'm kind of already from the course material I made, yesterday, I'm already changing things a little bit because things are, as always, changing in our reality field and nothing is stagnant. So that's also important to understand. Yes, we're talking about gates that are non-local. We are talking about gates that per se are what we could say. I put this in brackets so because I talked about it in podcast 2. So India is now a D4 gate. And that's interesting to have that notion and understanding. Okay, they used to be D3 gates, but now it's a D4 gate. How can that be? Because our reality has changed just since I made the podcast on part 2 and today, because things are moving so quickly now as we are entering into the 2004 timeline compared to the 2001 timeline we were on when I did the Souls of Humanity and the HAL Philosophy book. So the question is, in 2000 and on the 2001 timeline, were the gates then, as I explained it in the previous podcast, and in 2004 timeline, they have now shifted and changed into something else, because that's the whole idea with the understanding that we're now shifting into 2004 timeline that will lead to the 1999 possibilities, whereas the 2001 timeline kind of fizzles out in 2135, and then that's it. So here we are having a little bit of what we could say a course correction, as we are dealing with the shift of reality, the change of reality. And in that also understand that since we are part of holographic reality fields that are changeable according to the types of life forms and consciousness potentials that are unfolded there, then the architecture of the construction will change accordingly. Or they could be transferred. Literally, you can take the Indian, or the gate in India, and move it into a D4 level, which goes with the Southern Hemisphere that now in many ways or forms are shifting into, dimension 4 of the outer domain. And there will be pieces of original, or the enclosure, because this is what it is. We're talking about enclosure land masses that used to be D4. They are now D3, or used to be D5 and are now become D4 and moving around these gate systems because we have divided, as I talked about, the planet or the enclosure is now 4th and 5th cycle, means that whatever's in the 4th cycle will be pushed further or closer to the D3 level that is now mainly connected to what we call Easter Island, Pacific Ocean, the Japan, China, and Russia, because of the latest series of events that has happened. And even though I say the Pacific Ocean, am I talking about the South Pacific Ocean, or am I talking about the so again with this different kind of terminology, but the understanding is here in all of its broad prospects that Lemuria were part of what we understand as the South Pacific Ocean, and then we have what we call the Atlantics that are between America and Europe, that belong to what we say the remains of the Atlantean projects, and not the Mu projects, the reseeding. So in a way, the Pacific Ocean is, even though it's now a D3 gate, it actually used to be a D4 gate connected to the continent of Mu, but Mu were also reseeding. Anyway, so this is where it just becomes so complicated. We're trying to work with it in a linear manner. And the takeaway of this is nothing is stagnant. Everything is changeable. The construction changes, reality changes, the setup changes. So if we kind of say, oh yeah, I want to go to the D4 gate in Egypt under the Sphinx, then in 5 years or 10 years, it might not even, that gate might even be there, because the old version of it is being demolished and destroyed because of the changes that are happening in Africa, overall speaking, because even say, well, Egypt is part of Africa, right? So that's the large continent that are now being swooped up and taken over by what we understand as the Orion races. But is it the ones after the timeline event or prior to the timeline event? What timeline are they on? So we are now beginning to understand that reality is going to change quite profoundly, as if you're still part of the fourth cycle, you go to Egypt, yes, you will see the D4 gate in its destroyed version. But if you go to Egypt and you're working on a 2004 timeline, you might actually see the brewing D5 version of it that will come in the future. And that's a different Africa we have in the D5. That's actually where Africa no longer has deserts, no longer has drought, no longer has anything, because it has been re-engineered or terraformed into becoming quite what you call prosperous landmass or a continent as it used to be during the times of Atlantis. We could say Africa carries the remains of the original Atlantean grid work, but not entirely. There were alterations done to it to prevent the dark forces from rising up, which did not succeed. Hence, some of the issues that we are having with what we understand as the Orion conglomerate down there now. So again, pointing here is that instead of going through the different gates and say, oh, that's sealed off and that is active and these kind of things, I want to go a little bit more loosely over the material and say there are things that should be noticeable. First and foremost, it depends on if we're on the 2004 timeline or the 2001 timeline. 2001 timeline is now the what remains of the fourth cycle and all of the different groups that belong to the hijacker races, the regress races, the density 2 races, what have you. These features that are now connecting to the transhuman agenda, the parallel universal matrix and all of their variations, alongside with the phantom matrix that are a part of that. And what we call entering into the demolition, destruction, devastation cycles, where the fourth cycle will then eventually end up being part of the phantom matrix once the hybrid races, the POM races are done with whatever they're doing here. They will then just let whatever they have been occupying fall into the hands of the phantom matrix. So that's the agreement they have made there. And because of that, as I talk about other places as well, in the Changemaker material, for instance, the Toolkit Course 2, where I put a little bit of an update of what's going on right now, so to speak, there it should be taking into, I might as well, I was just thinking if I were to put it here, but I won't. It's just Changemaker material here. We're doing the host material, the higher order systemic energetic awareness. So we are working from a different angle here. But point being is that our reality will change according to whether you're on the 2004 timeline or you are on the 2001. 2001 timeline connects to the fourth cycle and the remaining parts of what that leads to. That's the 2001 timeline with the one that was activated with the 9/11 event under the Niburian races, the Orion conglomerate, the remaining Old World Order, the Giza complex, the different groups of military projects, what have you, all of that has been running their course and now reached that level where the remaining fifth cycle races and the ones that can connect to the fifth cycle said, yeah, we're kind of done with that. We're now moving into the fifth cycle and leaving completely the fourth cycle. And by that, use the timeline of 2004 that was ignited with the tsunami in Thailand, the Sumatra tsunami that were connected to D4. And by that created a complete new timeline unfortunately, with an enormous loss of or an enormous level of casualties, which were unheard of. I think there was 250,000 people that died there. So that's a little bit of a huge move. And you can say, well, was it the plan that should swoop over and clear out Thailand the way it did? Well, in a way, Thailand is a third cycle country. So by that there was a lot of, if we are to put it a little bit in a nicer way, there was a lot of people that had the opportunity to leave the planet at the time. And that lifted up the possibilities for the 2004 timeline that leads to the fifth cycle. Because remember, the timeline event were connected to the third cycle and fifth cycle. So that's how that was created. And at the same time allowed for a lot of races that were connected to the vessels in Thailand, the ones that were there on vacation and onward and so forth, to leave our reality field and freeing up code streams and viability rate for the 2004 timeline to be created. It was a very sad event, but we have seen that over the course of history. For instance, the Tonga volcanic eruption, that was also a T4 gate actually, that got destroyed there, and huge portions of Australia and all of the islands around there were affected by that, and whole groups of indigenous people were wiped from the planet. So we have had a lot of these things going on that takes away huge portions of civilizations to free up code streams and free up potentials, and by that create new timelines from where new seedings and new types of reality fields and new types of molecular structures can come into play. It's a tough process, and I don't agree with it, and I don't find that's the right way to do it, but that is how these different groups are doing it. So it is what it is. It's like yelling at the wind. I can't change that it's blowing, but I can say it sucks and I don't appreciate the heavy wind that's going on. And the same with these kind of things, because I think that is a very, is wrongful use of energy and consciousness, and is wrongful use of the reality field, and that's not in alignment with the progressive races and how we would do it, right? So let us just put it that way. But that is what it is. So that's why we are on the 2004 timeline, that we're freed up. Let's do the positive version of it. And in that, you say, well, what's the difference between the 2001 9/11 sacrificial ground of the two towers, the Twin Towers? Well, first and foremost, this was Twin Towers, at least to some of the old magic, old stuff, what have you, and it was done differently. It was done in a different manner. It was done by aliens. Anyways, there was completely different there. It was not by agreement. It was by violence. So that's the difference when we talk about these freeing of timelines and creating specific. The 2001 timeline was already there, but they solidified it and connected it to the underworld with the violence of 2000 or the 9/11 event. Whereas the 2004 timeline were freeing up, progression dynamics, put it that way, viability rate, code streams, and at the same time releasing large portions of humans that were then ready to leave our planet and go somewhere else and say, yeah, that's good, I'm out of here. So that meant that some of the gates between the reality fields were opened up and allowed for that transfer of souls out of the enclosure, again, into the different realities they originally came from. And most of these were probably either imprisoned or enslaved. So it's not a happy ending for them either. Where they went, I can't say. But I'm just getting the sense that, yeah, it's not painted with rosary glasses and make it more pretty than it actually is, right? Because are any of us free inside this reality? Do we really have a choice? As in kind of, yeah, woke up one morning thinking, yeah, today's going to be a tsunami and I'll leave this reality field. No, not really, right? So let us not make more out of it other than just put that in so we kind of have an understanding that the enclosure and the administration of the enclosure is not always what we would say in the eyes of what we will call philosophical and ethical value systems that we kind of praise as humans inside this reality field or as part of the enclosure, right? Okay, so we are here having the different forms of gate systems that are shifting around, and what I want to point here in the direction as well is that we have the D5, D6 level, and I deliberately put a kind of a slash there. And then I say old Crete, old Africa, old Australia, and old Tibet. And that is because, and that's where now Australia, as we know of it today, is actually under the fourth cycle. But the Uluru still used to be what we call a D6 gate. So even though Uluru has changed, we know that they have been tampering around with the gate in Uluru, and it has now been downsized and shifted into a D5 gate, predominantly also a D4 gate, but I'm not going to put it up under D4, but it technically is. The old version of it is a D5 gate, D6 gate, because it can swap into different levels. The current version of it is a D4 gate. Sorry about that. So in that, we can also say old Africa is when we had the Atlantean network, then it was a D5 gate. Today, we would say probably more a D3 gate, right? And old Crete, it used to be a D5 gate. Today is probably a D3 gate. So we have the old version of it that we call the esoteric, the inner level of it, the higher dimensional levels. And then we have what we call the outer or inside the enclosure version that links to the different levels of our reality. So in a way, I could say all of the gates, more or less, they are D3 gates, right? Because they're connected to the enclosure and the passages out. So with that little understanding, we can also here say, okay, this is clearly more difficult than we think. And again, I would recommend if you want to do kind of another aspect or another approach to the Stargate, well, then there's the Voyager material that works with that as well, or some of the other crystalline races and some of their material that is out there. But bear in mind that these gates are holographic. They are interactive, which means that they are dormant until someone activates them, not necessarily by pushing the button, but actually by knowing how to connect to these gates consciously. They are built upon the conscious connection. Some of them are built upon crafts that can move through the gates, but that is also a conscious connection with the ones that are on board the craft. It can also link up to a drone craft that has no personnel on board, but then there will be a pinging as a kind of a signal that will be sent from the drone, and it will have a signature because it has inbuilt what we could call ownership sigils, symbols that works in the same way as genetics would, so that the gates will have been recalibrated to be able to allow drones to pass through. So that's also a function these gates can have. They are changeable. They can shift position all depending on the changes of the reality field. They can level up and level down all depending on the modifications that are done to them. They are connected to specific racial lineages, and that's why I put in these different countries, because they are technically different lineages connected to different seedings of different types of human projects inside the enclosure, as after the timeline event, as part of the restoration program, later on as part of the different colonies on the different groups of races that were here, trying to undo the effects of the timeline event, ending up in our current type of civilization that were re-engineered and reseeded after the last ice age, some 15,000 to 12,000 years ago. And then under the old world order and the hijacking races. So by that, we understand, yes, if we're working with the different levels of code streams and the different levels of our energy system, or if we connect to different levels of our architecture, our perceptual sphere, connected to earlier code streams or timelines in the past, then we will see how these gates look different, how they operate different, how they were working different. And even though I say, well, some of them are still active or some of them are destroyed, you can destroy what we call gate systems that on a holographic level. So you can say, how do you destroy a holographic gate or a Stargate, right? You go into the nodal point and you literally use toroidal technology or torus technology. You go in and blast it to pieces using the void energies where you suck it all out and create what we technically would call a black hole. So instead of being a gate that leads between different stages and states of reality, then it just is a black hole that when you get there, you get sucked into the void. So that's how you destroy a gate. You can seal it off by putting alien technology on top of it, so you kind of keep it dormant, so it can't activate. You can use that in different ways and forms, and that's what's been done to many of the gates. For instance, the one in England, you know that one, right? Stonehenge. But actually, science have discovered that the stones that are in Stonehenge, they have been henge. I don't know why I still have issues with, is it henge or hedge? I don't know why, but my mind has difficulty with that. And that's probably because whenever I look at it, it's like, yeah, you have Stonehenge with the Druids and all these kind of shenanigans that are going on, but it's not the real gate. The real gate were actually positioned in Wales. Where does that gate came from? It actually came from, if science is correct, they tell us that the stones and the ones that built it were not the stones, but the ones that built it were actually migrants from Mesopotamia, or that area, rural area around Mesopotamia, and that the civilizations that lived there, the black-haired, that then moved to Wales and settled there, but Wales were too harsh, so they took their stones and transferred them to Stonehenge in southern England, where the weather was more mild, because Wales is a little bit of a rough country. But the question is that true? Is that really true? We don't know, but I do know that whatever's left in southern England that are part of Stonehenge is sealed off. Whatever's there is sealed off. And it does connect to the original Celtic races, but not the Celts that we know from the Mediterranean area and the Mesopotamian areas, because the Celts actually came from there and migrated upwards to England, as we know. But the original Celts that were a part of Syrian A, Syrian B race that had both of them inside their culture, and they were connected to what we would call the Nuburian lineages, as well as under the control of the Dracos after the hijacking. So that's a completely different civilization that used to live in England, that were overtaken by the Baal races, because that's the black hair that migrated, the Baal races. And that's why England today is Baal ruled. But it is no longer, that's with the nobilities, the aristocrats, the kings and queens and all that. That's Baal. But the original gate is sealed off. So they could have built a Baal gate on top of it, which most refer to when we talk about the gate in England or Stonehenge and what's there. And that's how I see it. The original gate is sealed off and dormant beneath under the Celtic species, or the Syrian Bs and the Syrian As of the Celtic variety. And they were completely conquered and taken over by some of the dark dragon races. I see how these dark dragon crafts come in, and the dragon races are part of a third cycle civilizations that used to live in the abyss and rose from the abyss that no longer exist, but we have remnants of them on different timelines. Some of you might encounter these old dragon races that has been mystified and sometimes are made into more pretty races than they actually were. But of course, there are white dragons and black dragons and red dragons and gray dragons and what have you kind of dragons. But they are third cycle creatures, and they are monsters of the abyss, similar to the great snakes, similar to some of the great, there are different third cycle entities that were part of the middle domain at some point in history. Anyways, I'm not going to go into all of these dark shenanigans and dark stuff, because that's not where I want to put our attention. Just so you kind of know that whatever people are coming up with, always work with from what you feel is the right approach to things, and be mindful that there's a lot of distortion. There's a lot of trying to make things prettier than they are. There's a lot of people that are using mythology and drumming up new distortion teaching systems that alludes to this or that or whatever. And most of that are part of the parallel universal matrix today. All of these incoming fourth cycle races that are under the POMs or under the phantom matrix, they use cubes, AI, that are literally going in and scanning our internet and scanning everything that we put out there. And then they combine it in new variations, and then it pops up as a new type of teaching. But if you really follow the train of thought and you look into the thought forms, then at least that's how it worked for me with some of the new stuff that comes up with all of these fancy things. You're going, whoa, they're complete fantasy land, first and foremost. And secondly, it's so incoherent and it's so confusing and it makes no sense to me. It's like when I look at it, it's like looking into a scattered patchwork pattern that has no coherence to it, that has no information to it. It's just made there to literally scatter the minefield for those who embark on these teaching systems and lead them down new rabbit holes where they get linked up to different forms of AI drone technology that will then take over the minefield. And that's a different perspective of a fifth cycle under the POM races. That's how they are going to do the fifth cycle under these groups, because they're not interested in us or the ones that are under the POM factions to at all reach the fifth cycle, but they engineer a false fifth cycle. So people think, oh yeah, I am part of the fifth cycle of the fifth dimension. But the matter of the fact is that they are just in another rabbit hole where the minefield is being overridden with different types of AI engineered information systems that seems pretty and interesting and fairy tale like and rainbow and unicorns and dragons and what have you. But that's because, in my opinion, as always, that people are longing for these dream state fantasy worlds of the perfect Atlantis and the perfect utopia and the perfect civilizations where the lion and the lamb are sleeping together and where the dragons walk amongst us and where the unicorns come back and where the little fairies fly around and make us feel happy, right? So that's what they're engineering there for the ones that are getting fed up with the hardship and the challenges of the actual world that we're trying to transform, and the very extended types of difficulties that just comes one after another. So in essence, these programs that they are making of the fifth cycle false teaching systems are what we call an escape, and are engineered as such for people that kind of, yeah, you want to get out of here? Yeah, there you go. By following these teachings, instead of learning how to work with their genetics and upgrade their energy systems and do all the hard work and get the control of their life, learn to master the base program, learn to master their energy systems, learn to master the three lower fields, do the reconfiguration of their molecular state, getting ready to move into the fifth cycle, create a new energetic architecture, learn to work with the higher order sciences, study all the things that needs to be studied when you work with the higher order sciences, including also studying base program sciences, doing psychology, doing kind of change maker material, making your own business. Yeah, I get it why people would rather just read about dragons and fairies and what have you, because there's a little bit of reprieve in a very challenging reality that we're part of. So there is always more to be said, and there's always more that can be added in. But I think for now, more or less, this suffices as things are now. If need be, later on when we talk about the Stargates, then there would, that's why I call this the basics. Then we might build more in as we get further into the high order systemic energetic awareness that will technically tomorrow on January 6th, there is a kick off of what we would call soft disclosure programs. And I'll be talking about that in the HOS, high order systemic energetic updates for 2023. Where that will be, that's another test project or pilot project. I talk about that other places as well in the whole Changemaker updates, where I talk about the fifth cycle and how we are to operate inside the enclosure as part of the fifth cycle. But here in the higher order systemic energetic awareness, we'll look a little bit more as in kind of the alien agenda from the perspective of the different races that are now recreating their version of the fifth cycle and their version, activating their version of the workstations in the fifth cycle. So that will be kickstarted tomorrow, where I will begin then rolling out the soft disclosure. What does that mean? What are the processes? How do we work with the psychological challenges of this, and how those of us who are part of the fifth cycle, but are to also begin to understand that the fifth cycle bridges into real connection with different type of otherworldly species, races, otherworldly processes, otherworldly sciences, otherworldly ways of living, otherworldly ways of existing on the 2004 timeline, leading to the 2025 timeline jump that will lead us all firmly into the fifth cycle. So right now we are catching up in the 2004 timeline. How is that going to play out? How efficient do we have to be to reach the 2025 timeline? Can we reach another potentials of it at a later point, and onward and so forth? So there's a lot of new dynamics that are now kicking in. So here at the end of the Bridges course here, I'm going to say, well, so far, everything you have learned are accurate, But bear in mind that even though the fundamentals are accurate, then the exemplification of it, the actual way they're being used, the de facto version of them, that is what they change into, change according to the cycles, it change according to the races actively being part of the reality field segments. It changes according to inserted technologies. Everything can be shifted around in the fifth cycle, even more so. Different groups, different races operate in different manners. I strongly suggest you listen to some of the material that I'm coming out with other places as well, so that you're not just getting stuck on the high order energetic systemic awareness thinking that's all that there is, because there are also the progressive sciences that completes the fourth cycle, leads into the forerunner material, adapts the transformative energy system, works with the template sciences, work with the clearing of the old world order technology. There's the Changemaker project where we begin to work with the outer domain fifth cycle energies, trying to implement them, change the way the surface and the ways that our world is working. But when on the 2004 timeline, we will run in the 2004 timeline for a couple of years, perhaps 5, perhaps 10, who knows, perhaps shorter. Then we will shift into the 2025 timeline. That for now is the fifth cycle timeline, the main timeline. That might be altered. That might be recreated. That might be seen as, yes, the viability rate is too low. Then we will shift into a different level. That will be the 2025 timeline 2.0 and onward and so forth. So this is where those of you who are having the high order systemic energetic awareness and those of you who are becoming change makers that are aiming for the higher order progressive energies and learn to work with these, that will be the HOPE project, where we will work with our version of the fifth cycle and our version of the original progression dynamics and progression energies under the ancient ones. But right now, here in 2023, we are under the rulership of the fifth cycle races of the different groups, as I talked about, that are now taking over the enclosure and are working from the workstations, but not in their fourth cycle version, but in their fifth cycle version. That's completely different species. That's the fifth cycle version of what was part of the fourth cycle. And that might be a little bit difficult to understand, but I'll talk about that in the kickoff of the 2023 Changemaker Food, Health and Environment project, where we kind of understand, there are different variations, different groups and different probabilities and possibility fields that activates different levels of reality, and by that present different variations of the same feature, as we will also see with our reality, where we will have one day you go into a shop and then the owner is the same all days you go in, but what's behind, what segment it will be part of, that faction that will be on top of that shop that day will differ, all depending on what kind of energies that are being rolled out inside the reality and the changes that are happening almost from day to day, and sometimes up to several times each day, where we need to learn to be on top of, okay, what does that mean? And the gates play a huge role in that, because if for some odd reason the fourth cycle races amp up their gates and in that manner makes them stronger, then the fifth cycle gates will then become weaker because they're technically a different version of it. And then there will be this counterback from the fifth cycle races trying to take it over. So we'll have that is part of the time wave continuum, where we'll have that flux of between fourth cycle and fifth cycle, at least for a couple of years. And that's why we want to do the 2025 timeline complete jump, where we no longer in any ways or forms will be connected to the fourth cycle. And by that, I also understand there are different dynamics in the work that we are doing as part of the fifth cycle, closing up what remains of our connection points to the fourth cycle. And then once we're done with that, then our reality that we perceive, what we will read of news, what we will see on the internet, what we will be part of in any ways and forms, will then be on the 2004 timeline. And that's interesting to have that idea that there are actually people across the street that are still part of the fourth cycle, but whatever they read in the news are dissimilar to what you read in the news. Unless you meet up and you discuss some of the news, then you will see that there are similarities. But in that moment of time where a fourth cycle human and a fifth cycle human should by any means or forms in the future link up together and meet in a joint field, well, then there will be a drone that will administer the information so that the fourth cycle human would not be able to interfere with the fifth cycle human. So this is a completely different reality setup. That means that we will be able to walk amongst each other's. But due to the fifth cycle segregation dynamics and drone technology, those of us who are part of the fifth cycle, we will no longer, after 2025, be affected by fourth cycle humans. We will see them, we will observe them, but we will not in any ways or forms be affected by what they are, what they hold, and what they are part of. And if we do meet up, drone technology will make sure we have a scenario that allows us for a communication. We will have these weird moments where we kind of glitch out of what we're talking about. What we're talking about, I can't remember. Okay, then we'll talk about something else that is allowed, where there will be no interference created, where there will be no possibility for an interference pattern, or what we call an energetic bridge or energy cord from the fourth cycle human to our energy system, because they will, as we go further into the future, fourth cycle humans will be very, very energetically hungry, and everything that's in them will be enormously hungry for more energy. So that's why that has been put in place. So that's also part of the work with the bridges. And that's also why they are lifting up and why they're being changed and why they begin to run a new type of energies that connects to the workstations in a different manner. And that's also why many of the gates that used to lead into the artificial realities outside the enclosure will be shut down, and then there will only be gates to the workstation, and the workstation will then be the hub and not what we could say the ways that the old world order races did it, creating access point and entry points inside the enclosure. So that will also be shut down. So there will only be exit points from the enclosure into the workstation, and then the workstations will be the administrators of the different groups that will come in from other planes, other domains, or other galaxies, if you like, other systems and other reality fields. So that's how that one is going to change eventually as well. So here we're having a little bit of the old version of it, shifting into the current version and shifting into the future version, where we understand everything is going to change now. That's why I keep calling it a new reality, because things are changing now. It's no longer on the possibility. It is now being manifested. It is now being put into operation. They're running different pilot projects. And those of us who are part of these pilot projects, we will do what we need to do to later on shift out of that and work on under the D14 collective. But right now we are under the different groups that are called what we call the neo races of the original fourth cycle races that travel to the future, re-engineer themselves, travel back in time, all of these very difficult understandings of reality, and how they have linked up to future versions of themselves, and by that can now, via the time wave continuum, change their versions and lift into the fifth cycle, where they have then ignited the fifth cycle version of the workstations and have now become the new races that are similar to, they still have the workstation they had in the fourth cycle, but they are now reoccupying it completely and destroying their fourth cycle version, which is why the POM races will chew away what they can of what we call workstation 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6. And once the POMs are done, then all of that will fall into the hands of the phantom matrix, or the dark ones, and then the fourth cycle will cease to exist entirely. Then only the workstations that have lifted into the fifth cycle of workstation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 will then be the lowest point, and then the workstations 6 to 12 will, because workstation 6 is technically a bridge system or a bridge workstation, will then be part of the sixth cycle, and the sixth cycle reseeding races that will be seeded on what we understand as the northern hemisphere, the top level from the Arctic, which is melting. A new landmass will rise up, and that will not involve China, that will not involve Russia and these parts that are connected there to the northern hemisphere, and it will not be the entirety of Europe. It will be a new type of united Europe further into the future. So these are the changes that are happening. And in that, those of us who are part of the test projects or the pilot projects, we will also change accordingly. We will develop new type of psychology, new type of sciences, new types of living, new types of projects, new types of businesses, new types of partnerships, new types of parenting, new types of everything that we can come up with, because we are now seriously kickstarting the next level of the human civilizations that are going to do the full transition into the fifth cycle. So with that one said, thank you for listening in to this material where we have worked from the past into the present and slightly into the future. And the fifth cycle is no longer horizontal, it is vertical. So it's all about the mental field, perception field, mind field, sciences, understanding of things from the radiation level. The fourth cycle were all about the vibrational level, the heart field. We're now shifting into the mind field where we upgrade our heart field to work as vibrational, creational engineering, set in motion energies, pinging on the different code streams, unfolding potentials of the code streams. But the processes, the architecture, the creations are done via the mind field, patterns of change, understanding of the sciences, the laws, the principles, and the rules of what it means to be a progressive human or a humanoid under the solar riches inside the enclosure as it is being transformed and will continue to be transformed under the different fifth cycle races on the 2004 timeline, jumping into the 2025 timeline, and from that on create completely new type of human civilizations on this planet, which eventually will then shift out of the planetary form and resume its original reality field, multidimensional features, which at that point in time will be completely logical and will happen as people are leaving this type of vessel and are being reseeded into newer type of vessels, and eventually the world will be completely different, and it will happen gradually, it will happen slowly, and it will happen beneath our feet, and it will happen without we even knowing it, and by that we will just morph into the new settings, assimilate, being recreated, reconfigured, and those of us who have the awareness, we will know when it happens. Those who doesn't will just change their ways. It will just become the new norm, and they will not think much of it. So with that one said, thank you for listening in, and hope to hear and share more in the higher order systemic energetic awareness updates for 2023 and whatever I will come up with as part of the higher order systemic energetic awareness forum, leading us into the future of being a systemic civilization amongst other systemic races. Thank you.